Right, Année bonjour. My name is Kristine, and I'm super excited to do this teaching for everyone. I hope that you have lots of fun making hoop earrings with me. So for today's workshop, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what materials I'll be using, and I guess what I would suggest that other people use too. So here I'm just going to use some size 11 seed beads. These are the Czech seed beads. You can use size 10s as well, or whatever you have on hand, really. Yeah, you're basically just going to be brick stitching these onto your metal hoop binding. I'm also going to be using some Swarovski crystals. These are the rounds. They're 5mm in diameter. But what you can also use are the bicones. If you can see here, they have like a little, they literally look like two cones put together, kind of like a spinning top or something like that. And they're also 5mm in diameter. With regards to the size, I wouldn't go below 4mm because they do come in different sizes. So I wouldn't go below 4 just because then they get a little bit small, hard to handle really. But 4, 5, or 6 should be all right, whatever you have on hand and whatever you feel like using. I'm also going to be using a short beading needle because this is going to be a lot of brick stitch, so you won't have to do any, I guess, like large amounts of stringing on like you would for fringe earrings or something like that. And I've got some 45mm hoops, just to give you a concept of how big these are. So yeah, I'm going to cut myself some thread. I use 00 Nymo, and I double up on it, so you can use whatever thickness of thread you like. But if it's something thinner, like I know 00 is the thinnest, I would double up on it. But you can use whatever you have, and yeah. Alright, so I've cut myself a piece of thread that's about an arm's length. You can do more, but as I'm sure many viewers will tell you, this just means that the longer it is, the more likely it is to get tangled. So stay tuned. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to tie it on to the hoop finding. So here we go, here's my hoop finding. And I'm just going to tie it on with a little knot. It doesn't have to be super tight. This is so hard to do.
And note that I've already doubled up on my string and tied it with a knot.
So yeah, it doesn't have to be super tight because, in fact, if it's not super tight, that means you can move it around a little bit if you're not happy with the placement. For example, I know some people don't actually bead around the entire hoop. They'll only bead around parts of it, kind of giving it like a little embellishment. There we go. And I'm just doing a double knot because I want to make sure that doesn't come off. I'm also leaving a bit of a tail so that I'll be able to basically darn in the ends. I feel like that's knitting terminology, but now it's beading terminology. So here's what it looks like. And I'm going to start off by basically doing brick stitch. So this is going to be my first layer that's going to go all around the hoop. And how that's going to work is you're going to pick up 2 beads. I'm going to use these clear beads over here. I think my entire first row is actually going to be clear beads. So 2 beads. If you can see there. It's a little blurry. And I start off brick stitch the way that Julie Blair taught me. So go around the hoop and up through the second bead. So you should see that they're basically right beside each other now. And you'll notice that this one on the left is a little bit wonky. So to fix that out, you go down through your bead on the left, which is the first bead. There we are. And then you go up through the second bead again. So by the end of this process, you should have 2 beads beside each other on your hoop. To add more beads, pick up 1 bead at a time now. Go around the silver hoop finding. And then go back up through the bottom of the bead. And there you have it. So I'm going to put beads on the rest of this hoop, and I'll meet you on the other side. So while I'm just beading here, I did want to go on a little bit about different types of patterns that you can do for your hoops. So with the hoops, the sky is really the limit. It's up to you whether you want to put crystals or not. It's up to you how many lines of beads you want to do. It's even up to you like how many lines of beads, I guess, you want on one earring finding. Some of my general recommendations, I guess, would be that with the size 11 beads, I find that if you, I guess the optimal amount of rows of brick stitch beads to do is around 4 rows. This is just because as you're putting on more and more beads, you're increasing the radius of your circle. And with that, when the radius of your circle increases, so does your, the circumference, which is like the outside of it. So your beads get further and further apart. So I find that 4 is really the limit at how tightly, like where for me, I find that I like to use 4. If you wanted to put more rows of beads on, I would actually suggest after those 4 rows initial, you use a slightly larger size bead. So if you have size 11s for the first 4 rows, and then another row that's size 10, after that, your beads will look a little bit closer together than they were before. So it's kind of a neat trick. What I've also done in the past is done multiple, I guess, like rows of beads brick stitched onto one hoop. So what I've done is I'll do basically one pattern on my hoop. I'll fold it over and then do another row of beads, and this almost gets it looking kind of like a barrel. And I find that because you have 2 rows of beads, it's really easy to make a lot of cool shapes this way, to get a lot of cool effects, things like that. For example, I don't know if Danny will be able to send it to everyone, but I've made a couple of hoops that look like they're made up of little bows like that. And yeah, generally with brick stitch too, just because of how it looks geometrically, your beads are kind of set up like a pyramid. So for example, the next bead I'm going to be placing won't be directly on top of it. It's going to be in between these two beads for the next row. So that's just something to be mindful of when you're trying to figure out what you want your thing to look like. Overall, you can't really go wrong though. Everyone has their own unique style. No one's hoops look the same. No one's beadwork looks the same. And that's what makes it so beautiful. For my pattern today, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a row of gold followed by some light pink and some light purple, almost kind of like pastel colors, followed by another row of gold, and then I'm going to end off with the clear, or I guess they're not completely clear, but the somewhat translucent beads. I know they look white because I'm using white thread, but yeah. So towards the end of the finding, or I guess the end of this, you want to leave just enough room just so that you don't quite hit the end of the hoop, just in case you figure out that you want your design to look a certain way, so you need a certain number of beads. I find that if you leave yourself a little bit of wiggle room, it's a little easier to rearrange things, to do a little bit of pulling if you want to move your entire design over, and if you need to add beads later, like if you've already done one hoop and then you're trying to make its sister hoop, but you realize that you counted the wrong number of beads and you put on the wrong number of beads at the beginning, you can always just move it over a little bit and you'll have space for one bead. So maybe one bead's length. So I think maybe I'll just put on one or two more. See how this looks. Unless it's really the look you're going for, there's really no need to pack the beads in there and have the entire thing completely surrounded. Because I don't know if you can see, but this is basically where it ends. I've still got a little bit of wiggle room here, so I think I'm going to add one more. Alright, here we go. Alright, so now I'm going to be starting my second row, and I'm going to start it almost the same way that I started the first row. So I like to turn my beadwork over just so I'm beading in the same direction every time. I am going to put on 2 beads. This time it's gold, but you can use whatever color you'd like. So here's where it gets a little complicated. So if you can see between the seed beads, there's these little thread bridges, as I learned from Julie Blair. So you're going to go underneath not the first, but the second thread bridge. So this guy right here. And you'll see that right now my beads look kind of like they're beside each other. So I'm going to go up through this second bead right here, so it's going to look flat. But this first one is a little bit wonky, so just like we did before, I'm going to go down through it. Whoops, only this bead, so all the way down, pull through. Having some difficulty. There's moments of that when you're just like, is this bead going to break? Alright. There we go. And then go up through the second bead. Oh, I've got a bit of a knot going on here. And there we are. And like we did before, you're just going to put on one bead at a time afterwards. So put on one bead. I'm going to go through the nearest thread bridge. So underneath that. And then I'm going to go up through this bead here so that they're all lying close together, flat. And then you're just going to do that for the rest of, your row. So now they have this hoop finished here, I just want to talk a little bit what happens with the edges. So you can actually keep it without any edging or crystals or anything like that. All you would do would basically be go down through this bead right here, and then basically tie a knot around the bead, weave the rest of your thread in, and then that would be one way to finish it off. If you're using a different color other than something that looks white, what I like to do is I also like to color in the threads here with a Sharpie so that they match. So for example, if I'm doing something turquoise, I'll use like a blue or a green Sharpie to go around so it's a little less obvious that there's a thread going on there. If you're doing the, if if you're doing these Swarovski crystals, it's basically just a modified brick stitch, but now you have these crystals here. So first put on 2 beads, or 1 bead depending on how big your crystals are. I'm using 2. Put on your crystal bead, and then put on another 2 seed beads. So it looks like this. And then usually around, I guess 2 to 3 thread bridges later, depending on how the spacing looks. Like that looks kind of alright. You can also test it out and see what looks good. Yeah, like that looks fine. Yeah, so there I just basically did a brick stitch around that one, this thread bridge over here, and then we're ready for the next one. So instead of starting with 2 seed beads, you start with 1 crystal bead. Put on another 2 seed beads because these are kind of big beads. If I were to put less on, it just would be more difficult to, you'd get almost like a puckering effect on the crystals. And depending on how your spacing is, you might have to adjust the number of thread bridges that you skip. Or you might end up having to, you might either have to skip or basically change how you're spacing. For example, here it's a lot, all of the thread bridges are a lot longer, I would say, than in this section. Everything's a lot closer together. So here I might do a little bit less, and I can also see that this is almost like lagging a little bit. So instead of doing 2, I'll do 1 this time. Tighten it up, basically. So yeah, it's all about finding like a balance between not using up too much of your resources if you're running short on supplies, and also sometimes there's no need to use so many things when you can just space them out a little bit unevenly. And there's a little bit of beauty in the asymmetry of that as well. Now here I am just brick stitching, so I went under the thread bridge and then go up through the 2 seed beads. And pretty soon I'm also going to give another tutorial, because as you can see my thread is getting a little bit short, or you might not be able to see from the video. But yeah, it is getting quite short. So yeah, inevitably, sometimes when you do this, you can actually use up all of your thread. In the middle, sometimes you'll have enough for the entire thing, but sometimes you'll just run out. And as we get closer and closer to the edge, I can show you as well how I put more thread on. Basically the concept is that I just tie it. I tie it, instead of like a double knot, I do a triple knot just because I find that it stays a lot better. And then I kind of just start working, and the threads do tend to weave themselves into the work. So you don't have to worry about basically clipping them until the very end. As you're working, one important thing to notice is your tension and both your spacing. These are fairly, they're a little bit loose, but they still retain their shape. And you can't pull too hard, otherwise sometimes this thread can actually break here. So just something to be mindful of. That's way too much. So yeah, there's lots of experimenting to be done give it a go. See what you like, see what size beads you like, see what style you like. For example, these are the round style, but there's, like I mentioned before, there's also like a bicone style. And you can also use different types of crystal beads. You don't have to use the Swarovski brand. I just do because I like the way that they sparkle. But that's just a me thing. I tend to be like a bird and gravitate towards sparkly things. Okay, so now you can see that this is getting really short and is not going to last until the end of my hoop. So I'm going to cut it with a pair of scissors. Right near my needle. It's so hard to cut on camera. There we go. Take a new piece of thread. It's not super long. Thread my needle. Which I might do off camera just because it's so much easier. There we go. And then now I'm going to do a triple knot. So I remember growing up and going to Girl Guides, they always taught us that the square knot was one of the, I guess, like hardest knots, the most stable knots. So I'm just gonna show you there. So right now I have my, this thread whose tail end is in my left hand on top. Do a little wrap around, and then now it's back to my right hand and it's also on top. So here you can see that looks a little bit like a nice square coming together. And then just to make it ultra secure, I also do a third round. I find that even with the 3 rounds of knot tying, it's actually not that bulky, and it can still go through seed beads with a little bit of convincing. So I would definitely recommend it, just to give you like a peace of mind that your beadwork won't come apart. Oh, this is lovely beadwork that all of you have worked so hard to put together. Sometimes it can also be really hard to pull the ends. Don't be afraid to reach for a pair of tweezers if you're really having difficulty doing the precision work. I know I have relatively small hands, but it's really, really easy to, but even like my fingers I find are sometimes a little bit too big for, you know, this delicate work. Okay, there we are. Give it a little tug. That's not fudging. Alright, and now we're ready to keep going. Now I've already made 1 hoop, so I'm just going to count and see how I'm doing here for, this is what the finished product looks like. Alright, so see, there's not too much of an issue as the knot ends up going through the beads. Although I do not like where this is. Yeah, that's gonna be too far apart. Some days I'm better at judging the spaces, other days I'm absolutely terrible. It's a wonder anything gets made, honestly. But we all have our days. Alright, here we are. Yeah, so there, if you can tell, my knot's actually gone into the beading, and it's really difficult to tell that was even there in the first place. However, I am just going to give myself away and do some backtracking because I do think that looks a little bit strained. Yeah, that'll be fine. Alright, so I will join you back at the end. So I'm basically done. Here we are. Here's basically the finished product. So how I finished these up is I went through this big bead over here, went through it, and then I go down the second last, I guess, set of 2. Now I'm going to tie off by basically going around this little post here of 2 beads. Okay, it's pulled through. Then I do a double knot. Just want to make sure it actually gets pulled. There we go. Alright, so now we're all tightened up, and basically I just go through the rest of my beadwork, weaving in that tail end. Just follow the brick stitch pattern. It shouldn't stand out too much. Just go through as many beads as you like for it to feel secure. I know some people out there actually really don't like using knots, so instead they'll just use tension to tie the entire thing off. I do not have that much trust in my beadwork alone to keep everything from literally falling apart. Alright, so there we go. Do a little snip snip. Right at the edge. Ta-da! Can barely tell it was even there. Now, I've got to do the same for the tail end that we started off with. When we tied when we first tied the string around the hoop. I just wet my finger a little bit, so I go through both of these. And then because it's already tied, you don't have to tie a knot. All you're gonna do, once I thread this needle, it's so hard to double thread it. But yeah, what you're going to do is you're basically just going to go through your beadwork just like you basically, I don't want to say darned in the ends. I'm just going to do this closer to my face because it's difficult under the camera. But yeah, just go through all your beadwork again, and then it should do a pretty decent job of hiding the thread. And if you go through enough beads, it shouldn't unravel. Yeah, so for example, sometimes if your thread is really short, you're also going to basically have to like pre-go through your beadwork and then just basically pull it at the end. That's sometimes what I end up doing in situations like this, just because the tail is so tiny. This is why you always leave yourself a decent tail. Alright. Sometimes this can be a challenge and a half. Especially when you've got multiple threads going on, like I do here. It always thread one of them, but it really does not want to thread both at the same time. Okay, you know what? We'll do them one at a time. How about that? Part 1. Let's see if I can pick this guy out. I feel like I'm so used to bringing it so close to my face. Alright, so there we are, and then you just snip it off. I know some people also like to burn their ends off, but I haven't figured out a way to do this that will actually not burn my beadwork, as ridiculous as that sounds. There you have it. So part 1, part 2, ready to go. There. Part 1, part 2. So miigwech to everyone for coming along on this hoop beading earring journey. I hope everyone enjoyed it and you get some great Christmas gifts or gifts to donate to the community. Have a good one.